Lovely.
Hi to those of us who just joined us. This is the March webinar for the Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning, and we'll get started in just about a minute or so. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsten Verclas. I'm the Program Director of Electricity at the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASEO, and welcome to the March webinar for the Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning that NARUC and NASEO together are organizing. We have this webinar series going on for the task force about last summer. The task force the topics for the webinar have been reached by the task force members, suggested and agreed on, and we're very excited to have today Patty Richards from the Washington Electric Co-op giving us a presentation on their integrated distribution planning. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping announcements. The webinars are recorded and posted to the task force website. So if you want to revisit the slides or the recording, we invite you to go to the website. Throughout the webinar, the participants are muted, but we ask you to ask questions to the chat box or raise your hands on the organizer panel to your right. We will moderate the questions until the very end. We're excited to have Mary Ann join us today, who is Mary Ann Ralls, who is the Senior Director, Regulatory Counsel of the Government Relations Department of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and she will moderate the panel, the questions today. I wanted to, before we get started, introduce our speaker. Patty Richards is the General Manager of the Washington Electric Cooperative. She has been the General Manager since 2013. Prior to joining the co-op, she spent 3 years as a senior consultant with La Capra Associates, which is a Boston-based energy consulting firm. And in this role, she performed a wide array of power supply-related work on both the regional and national level. Before that, she was the Director of Power Supply and Transmission for the Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, where she managed power supply for a number of small munis, as well as the Washington Electric Cooperative interactions with the New England Regional Power Grid. She started her career at the Burlington Electric Department in Vermont, where she worked for 17 years in various roles, including administrative and energy efficiency-related positions, before becoming the Director of Resource Planning. She has a master's in business from St. Michael's College. Today, Patty will provide the overview of the Washington Electric Co-op, IRP, which has developed an IRP that is committed to the principles of meeting the consumer needs as cost-effectively as possible, and ensure that future innovations and research options are responded to. Patty will discuss the IRP's objectives and policy considerations today, and we're very excited to have her and Mary Ann on the webinar today. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Patty.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining in, and hopefully everybody sprung ahead with daylight savings time. What I thought I would do is just introduce Washington Electric Co-op a little bit, just to ground you in terms of who we are, and then I'll jump into the Integrated Resource Plan that I'll call IRP, and some of the planning work that we do. So Washington Electric Co-op is a not-for-profit, an electric cooperative by incorporation. And what that means is we came around in 1939 by consumers owning the cooperative, owning the electric utility. So basically, these were folks that were left behind from the investor-owned utilities. It said, the investor-owned utilities back in the 30s said, you know what, it's really expensive to get to you. We're not going to be able to string wires and poles on your roads and serve your homes and businesses, mostly farms back then. So the members all band together. There were roughly 150 that got together, and these were generally farms, small farms, that said, hey, we want electricity on the hilltops. So they formed a group, a collective called a cooperative, and started bringing power to the hills and the countryside. So as a cooperative, we started in 1939, again, with roughly 150 customers, and we have now grown to a 16 megawatt utility, which is still very small. We have roughly 11,500 meters, and some of those meters are, it'll be 2 meters on a property. So our membership is roughly 9,500, and our members own us. So they're the owners. So it's both a shared, like on an investor-owned utility has shareholders, our consumers, our ratepayers are the owners. Again, we're a small electric utility. We're about 16 megawatts. And that is, for the state of Vermont, we're roughly 1.3% of the state load, with about 11,500 meters. But in terms of township and land, we cover 41 towns and 4 counties, and we're 17% of the land, or the number of towns in the state of Vermont. You can see in the map on this first slide, the area in yellow is our service territory, and that relative to the entire state of Vermont, we're roughly 17%. And the reason I put that out there is because we are extremely rural. We are the least dense utility in the state. We have 8 customers per mile. And the challenges that brings with us, or for us, is we're heavily, our infrastructure costs are generally wires and poles and substations. If you look at our total cost of service, our power supply mix is roughly 35 to 40% of our total cost of service, where the wires and poles and infrastructure are the remaining balance. In the other piece in terms of our demographics, this next slide that is up, you'll see that we're heavily residential. We are, if you count the number of meters, we're 94% residential, and if you look at our per kilowatt hour sales, we're 87%. We'll go to the next slide. In terms of our power supply mix, as a cooperative, we are both a electric retail provider, and we also own our own generation. And what you'll see is this big maroon section called the Coventry Clean Energy Corporation. This is the lion's share of our power supply mix. We get 70% of our energy from this resource. We own the generating facility. It's 8 megawatts, and it's a pollution control device. So it burns off the methane from a landfill, and that's the bulk of our power supply. We also have about 10% coming from a wind project here in the state. We have another 3% coming from a small hydro plant that we own. It's the Wrightsville Hydro Plant, also in the state of Vermont. And then we have some smaller hydro coming from in-state PURPA contracts, a wood chip facility. And then the only out-of-state generation that we do receive is hydropower from the New York Power Authority, which is about 15%. Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to jump into integrated resource planning. So we are required by state statute and policy and rules and regulations to every 3 years file what's called an integrated resource plan. And I've just listed here the statutory requirement, which is the statutes in Title 30 to 18C, which regulate electric utilities. But basically this integrated resource plan basically says every 3 years, the utilities have to report out how they're going to meet their members, their consumers' energy needs when considering safety issues, life cycle costs, environmental costs, and anything else that's kind of a problem statement or a challenge for them, the IRP, we're expected to address what are things that are driving our issue list for the utility. We filed an IRP in 2017, received approval for that IRP from the Public Utility Commission, and the Department of Public Service also supported approval of that IRP. We work closely with our regulators. In this piece of work, it's a fairly big endeavor to pull off the IRP. It's 6 chapters, probably 100 pages long, several appendices. But I look at this as a great communication tool. Our next IRP is due this July of 2020, and we've embarked on the work that's going into it. And it's a great way every 3 years to check in to say, okay, what does our energy needs look like? What are our legislative programs going on? How are we plan to meet them? And also identify any transmission and distribution issues. So we'll click over to the next slide. So what I've just stated is what we cover in the IRP. We give a general overview of Washington Electric Co-op, basically who we are, customer demographics. You know, basically those first few slides, we talk about what our mix looks like. We talk about any policy issues that our board of directors are asking us to do. So our board is comprised of 9 members that are democratically voted in, and they serve 3-year terms. And the board of directors set policy for the cooperative, and then we'll report that out in our IRP in terms of what policy directions our board of directors would like us to go. We also talk in the IRP what our power supply mix looks like. We'll look at a load forecast for the next 20 years. We'll do some modeling on our resources to say, okay, in the event we have an issue, say at our Coventry landfill project, how are we going to recover from that, or what would our cost implications be if we had maybe half of it flowing and the other half not flowing. We'll look at portfolio evaluations, as I said, legislative and regulatory directives. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then we look at our transmission and distribution system, and then we'll talk about an action plan to address any concerns we might have. So basically it lays out, you know, big picture things, major projects that are going on in the utility, and we map out what we're going to do with those every 3 years. Okay, next slide. So this is a snapshot to give you an illustration of some of the things that we're looking at. So what you see here is a resource stack of all of our contracts and generation that Washington Electric Co-op owns. Those are the chunks that are in color, and it builds up our portfolio mix. And then you'll see a black line toward the top of the graph. That's our targeted, that's what we think our load level is going to be for the next 20 years. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm mapping out known and committed resources and contracts. How does our portfolio stack up relative to our load needs? And from this chart, you can see there's very little gap over the next 20 years. We have a small gap starting at roughly 2032. And this tells me, okay, we're full up in terms of our resource needs for the foreseeable 20-year future. We might have a little bit of management to do in the outer years, but not a tremendous exposure in the market from this power supply mix. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And then this is a little more granular look at our total resources relative to load. So that last chart looked at load on just an annual basis. And as we all know, electric utilities' monthly load levels fluctuate based on seasonal characteristics. So here I'm looking at my resource stack, my portfolio, and I'm contrasting that to my load on a month-by-month basis. And what this tells me is, okay, you know, in general, I have enough power supply to meet my load, but there are some times that I do have a little bit of open position, meaning I'm exposed to the wholesale market. And generally, this is in the January to, call it December to March. The winter period is where we have some exposure. And then this chart allows me to plan for, okay, if I want to do a winter hedge, I want to be looking at the winter time, but the rest of the year, I'm fairly well covered with my resource mix. So it's just a more granular snapshot. And these are things that we'll include in our IRP to give more flavor to our resource mix relative to our load requirements. Okay, now we'll pop to the next slide. One of the things that we're going to spend a fair amount talking in this next IRP that is going to be filed in this July of 2020 is what we are doing relative to legislative and regulatory directives. And I'm going to cover a handful of things that we're working on. So in the state of Vermont, we have a program for net metering, which is distributed generation, where we pay extra funds for our consumers, our members, to incentivize them to put solar or other distributed generation at their homes and businesses. This is actually in the state of Vermont a state program. So as a cooperative, we're regulated, we're fully regulated just like the investor-owned utility. And the state actually sets the rates rather than the cooperative setting the rates. So we are now paying roughly 19 cents a kilowatt hour for small scale generation, and that's 150 kW or less, for generation that's above and beyond what a consumer uses in a month. And that contrasts to what we see in savings from that power. We've calculated that we're actually losing roughly 15 cents a kilowatt hour for generation coming from that program. So while we like net metering in terms of the generation that's installed, we like solar, we support that, we're concerned about the rates that we're paying for that they're a little too expensive. And that's actually started to drive rate increases for us for the last 3 to 4 years. Right now, the total installed net metering to date is about 4.9 megawatts on our system. And as you know, we're a 16 megawatt utility. So that's actually 31% of our peak. And that's fairly significant. That's a big size chunk of small generation sprinkled across our service territory. And also on an energy basis, in terms of what's being produced by energy, it's roughly 7% of our retail electric sales. So net metering in Vermont, net metering in WEC's service territory is significant in terms of size. And again, it's starting to show up in terms of that volume, and it is driving rate increases. So that's one thing that we'll talk about in our integrated resource plan in some degree of detail, just to make sure the regulators are aware of this, so that as we come in for rate increases, folks understand that. The other thing I'm going to talk about in our IRP is this renewable energy standard, is this next block. We have three tiers of energy we have to meet for the renewable energy standard. And part of the IRP, I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about how we are going to meet each of the buckets, each of tiers 1, 2, and 3, and how we're going to comply with that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this piece of it, because I could talk for quite a long time just about the renewable energy standard, but this is a topic that is a really great thing to flesh out in an IRP, how we are planning to meet our requirements for a renewable energy standard. And again, Vermont has this 3-tiered system, and our programs that we have set up are well positioned to meet all 3 of the tiers. One of the other things that we'll talk about as well in this year's IRP is rate design. We have embarked this year on a step toward increasing our monthly customer charge, and at the same time reducing the energy value, with the goal of in trying to communicate by price to our consumers, our constituents, that we want people to use electricity in areas that they haven't used them before. And we're calling it beneficial electrification, where what we'd like to do ultimately is get people to get off fossil fuels like gasoline to drive your cars and switch over to electricity and be cleaner power, basically using WEC's power supply mix, which is 100% renewable, rather than using fossil fuels to help combat some of the impacts on climate change. So we're taking a step toward lowering the energy rate, increasing a monthly customer charge, with the goal of incentivizing people switching from other fossil fuels over to the electric space. We'll talk a bit about that in our IRP as well. The other thing that we'll talk on the legislative side is any energy goals that the state of Vermont has and any goals that our board of directors has. So this section of legislative and regulatory will spend a fair amount in our IRP and really flesh that out. Okay, for now, we'll move to the next slide. Another important component of our IRP is transmission and distribution. For Washington Electric Co-op, we feel climate change is already here. We've had 4 major storms, and I qualify major here as they've been eligible to qualify for FEMA reimbursement in less than 3 years. We have an aggressive plan where we're out hardening our grid, meaning we're shortening pole spans, we're putting poles closer together, we're doing reconductoring of lines to build stronger lines out there. Our right-of-way trimming budget has been increased to $1 million every year for the past 5 years. We've added to our trimming efforts, our tree trimming efforts. We also have the Emerald Ash Borer that has hit our service territory. We have a specific plan to remove all the ash in our right-of-way because the bug, once it hits the ash tree, the trees become extremely brittle and it's much more expensive to take the trees down. So we've got a plan to remove ash tree in the right-of-way. And my theme has been from climate change, we're seeing super bugs, super storms, and super expensive response to climate change. So in the T&D section, we're really talking about what we're doing relative to hardening the system, and that's an important piece of the IRP. We're also very mindful of the fact that consumers' expectations of electricity are a whole lot less tolerant in today's society for long-term power outages. People just can't tolerate any sort of length of a power outage. And the other piece of it that I'm looking at is the more we're electrifying people's energy use, if I get people to switch over to electric cars, it is going to be that much more important that we can increase reliability because people are going to become not only dependent on their current use for electricity, but also potentially their transportation use, their heating use. So it's going to be really important that we have a really robust electric grid to handle these storms that are coming through. So we're going to talk a bit in our integrated resource plan about what we're doing to harden our system and really improve on grid reliance. Distributed generation impacts we'll also talk about. We've had some areas on our system where there's been so much net metering installed that's actually causing what's called ground fault over voltage, and that's causing additional equipment being implemented on our system that we hadn't anticipated. So while solar may have some benefits to help and reduce losses and help in other capacities, it is actually having an impact on our T&D system where we're actually having to invest funds to add additional equipment so we can continually add more distributed generation. Another thing that we have in Vermont is a very large grid-constrained region called the Sheffield-Highgate External Interface. And that's a whole northern section of Vermont has too much generation, not enough load, and that's affecting Washington Electric Co-op's Coventry plant and Sheffield wind contract that is also in that area. So we'll talk a bit about what's going on in T&D capacity for what's called the SHEI, this grid-constrained region, in our IRP. And then we'll go to the next slide. And I guess that's the end of my slides. So that's a real high-level overview of Washington Electric Co-op in terms of who we are and what we do in this integrated resource planning space. And from here, I'll turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Patty. This is Mary Ann Ralls. Greetings, everyone. So the first question up is, DSP generally requires more granularity than IRP in terms of both time and geography. Does the WEC model assess both through a single set of data and modeling runs? And if so, how granular is the assessment in terms of time and geography?
I'm sorry, was that for distributed generation?
Distributed system planning generally requires more granularity than integrated resource planning.
So, every 4 years, we do what's called a construction work plan, which is a real drill down into our substations, into our feeders, into small circuit-based analysis of our system. And we do a complex evaluation, and then based on that evaluation and need of that, voltage flows and thermal flows, that tells us where we need to invest equipment, if we need to do a substation upgrade, and that really drives our construction work plan in terms of pole replacement, line loss consideration. And again, we're doing that every 4 years, and that actually fits in with our IRP, but it's actually a little bit longer time schedule for us.
Okay. So the next question is energy efficiency and demand response considered in the integrated resource plan? And if not, why not?
Yes, it absolutely is. The state of Vermont actually has a single entity called Efficiency Vermont that runs energy efficiency programs through the state. So while they're running the programs, we still do report that and consider that in our load forecast. And we actually work with Efficiency Vermont for some pilot projects. We're doing right now a peak load control program with staff from Efficiency Vermont, and we're trying to do some targeting of Efficiency Vermont programs to help them better deploy what they're doing to be of more assistance to the electric utility.
The next question is, are time and use rates in place to moderate the peaks in your rate structure?
So technically WEC has a time of use rate, but nobody has participated. We have nobody on that rate. We are in this next year going to embark on we're going to explore some various rate options, whether that's a time of use rate or maybe some end use technologies like an electric vehicle rate, and see if we might be able to come up with something that will help us deploy more effectively beneficial electrification, while at the same time allowing us to manage that load so that we don't drive new peaks. One of our biggest concerns is we want to make sure that we don't have added electrification on our system, but then it's used at a time where we end up having to upgrade substations because we have a higher load level. So we're going to look at that in this next year in a little bit more detail.
And Patty, just following up on that, I believe that at one point you guys had, was it a grid access charge?
Yeah, we had a net metering program. This was prior to 2017, where we charged a grid service fee that helped offset some of the losses that we were receiving from net metering systems, some of the financial losses. Unfortunately, that program is no longer in place because the state, the lawmakers here in the state said we want to be really aggressive in the net metering space. So the state came out with a new program, and our grid service fee program actually had to be mothballed and put away. So we're running the state program now.
Okay. How is WEC thinking about determining a resilience value for distributed resources, especially when those are part of a microgrid?
Resilience value. Not sure how to answer that. I mean, I think of distributed generation as certainly beneficial to the homeowner, but in terms of making the grid more reliable, I'm not sure that that's the case. And in fact, we have areas on our distribution system where we get too much solar penetration. It's making the grid a little less reliable. And that's why we're having to invest equipment for the ground faults that are going on that side. I don't know if that made sense. If I haven't answered that question, if somebody is thinking about it differently, happy to have them re-ask that question. But the transmission ground fault over voltage it's a significant issue. And basically, it's where the circuit is getting too much energy at a particular time relative to the load, that it's causing voltage issues, and it's back feeding up through the system where, you know, basically going in the opposite direction, where the transmission line would be feeding us. Now we're feeding the transmission line kilowatt hours, and it's causing circuit issues.
Okay. A clarification did come in that Adam is asking the question, made a distinction between resilience and reliability. And there was actually, I don't know if that helps you or maybe expands upon your response.
What we haven't been able to do is create any sort of microgrids that, you know, I haven't seen a case where we've been able to create a microgrid section where we've got a high degree of solar penetration and that's beefing up the reliability. So when we have a power outage, so if we have a line that comes down, a tree that comes down, hits the line, breaks the line, that solar system that's right close to that break in the line is going to kick off because the line is down. Okay. That consumer is not going to be able to use their solar system. So resilience, reliability piece, I'm not seeing that. I don't know any case studies where that's really actually the effect, unless somebody has battery backup and they can disconnect from the system.
Sort of staying within that same vein, are there other programs that can drive more investment into distribution systems like demand charges? We talked briefly about TOU rates, but that's another option.
Yeah, you know, there's plenty of rate structures that could be deployed, and we're going to start looking at that this year. In addition to a time of use rate, we're also going to look at a low income rate, low use, low income, to help people along. What my experience is, we have some folks that are very interested in electricity and want to play in the space of trying to manage their electric bills and, you know, really get into it in a detailed way. The biggest bang for your buck in that space are businesses. The commercial industrial user has more ability and a bigger price tag that they want to manage their bill. Most homeowners, I mean, again, there's always an exception, but the vast majority of homeowners, you know, their bill is $100 a month, you know, somewhere between $75 to $100 a month. It's not a big ticket item. We don't have a lot of people, you know, yammering at us, so to speak, to say, hey, we want to do some fancy rate structures and try to control how we use our home use to, you know, at different times of the day or different peak control programs. I think there's going to be some penetration in that space. I just don't see it as a driver on the residential side. Most people, they get up, they go to work, they come home, they want to have dinner. They don't really want to mess around with managing loads. The C&I space is a different animal, where they've got much bigger bills and they're more driven to do stuff because there is a dollar implication that could be managed better. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
So we're switching topics here. Do you see a need to upgrade your pole-mounted transformers, given the push for EVs and electric heat? And if so, do you think that doing this over time, do you look at doing this over time as the load increases, or just in one fell swoop?
So right now, the electric vehicle space and the cold climate heat pump space, which is the electric side of heating, we are seeing some deployment, but the numbers are not great. And what I am seeing, a lot of the consumers that are installing solar and net metering systems are the same consumers doing electric vehicles and on the heat pumps. So we are increasing transformer sizes for net metering, especially when they have electric vehicles. Ultimately, when we start seeing more of the market mature relative to the electric vehicle space, that's a possibility that we could see going from 5 kV transformers up to 10 and 15 kV. So it's definitely an issue that's on our radar screen.
Okay. Has WEC tried to assess hosting capacity for DG? And if so, are hosting capacity maps available to members and developers?
Hosting capacity meaning we would build a centralized project. If that's the question, we have not, and the reason we have not is because our portfolio mix, which is already 100% renewable, we're already full up to meet our energy needs. And part of the state requirement to develop and build new projects is you have to demonstrate a need. So I would have to show my load is greater than my resource mix, and for the next 15 years I'm full up and I don't demonstrate a need. So we haven't looked at a community solar project or anything of that nature at this point.
Okay. I think that in this context, hosting capacity is whether or not the feeders are sufficient to handle the DG.
So we do any of the larger net metering systems, and I'm going to say larger, that's like 50 kW on up. We look at those systems in terms of where they're located. And we've had a couple of systems that we've had required to do what's called a system impact study. And in that regard, we'll look at the infrastructure on our side and whether or not there's going to be expenses and equipment needed to install and able to host that site. And according to the rules in the state of Vermont, we're allowed to charge the system impact fee for that cost to the developer of that project. So the larger projects we're definitely looking at, and we have charged some of the costs out to the developers for any impacts on our system.
Okay, so for the larger developers, I guess in those instances, you do have maps or some sort of resources that are available for the members and the developers. Is that right?
So really it's a case by case. Some of the utilities have what are called heat maps, to say, don't build here, but you can build here. We don't have those lined up yet. It's one of the things on our wish list to do. Hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to come up with that, but our engineer that we work with hasn't been able to facilitate that yet. But we definitely know where in our systems we have some feeder issues that, wouldn't be a good place to locate a solar. We might already have a large solar on that site or near that location, which could cause problems, and we basically handle it on a case-by-case basis at this point.
Okay. Thank you. So next question is, Vermont is a vertically integrated energy state. Can integrated distribution planning be translated from a muni to an IOU and one in a competitive energy market? So is the integrated distribution planning flexible enough to go back and to translate and have use by others in the state?
That's a good question. So in a retail choice paradigm, the utility is no longer owning a portfolio. So they don't have the assets, they don't have the generation responsibility in terms of reporting out what you're going to do in that space. I do think that some degree of planning relative to T&D, your transmission and distribution lines, and being able to communicate that to whether it's regulators, your board members, your constituents, an IRP could really work in that space. You can certainly talk about any legislative programs you're responding to, rate design. I think that's a really a big topic these days in terms of rate design and how we're controlling for increased peak on our system. I think there's plenty of things left over that you could still use an IRP as a reporting tool of what you're up to and how you're meeting your energy needs other than power supply.
Okay. And that's certainly something that if you had another state with the same market construct,
yeah,
would transfer on over. Okay. All right. Thank
yeah,
you.
I mean, the old days of IRPs, they were primarily, how are you going to get your power supply? What are you doing in your resource mix? But the IRP of today's world also is heavily focused on any regulatory programs, how you're going to respond to renewable energy standards, for example, you know, transmission upgrades, rate designs, those things. People are interested in hearing about what you're thinking in those spaces.
Okay. And I'm encouraging folks to send, these questions have been great. It's been a good conversation. Thank you. Please send in more questions. So I want to go back to one thing that you said at the beginning, Patty, of your slide deck, and that is that you see your plan as a great communications tool. And then when we started talking about, you know, the various components here of the plan and the various goals, you said that, you know, consumer tolerance for having outages is really, it's diminishing probably rapidly.
Yes.
What sort of stakeholder engagement did you have? I know you're regulated, but what sort of stakeholder engagement process did you go through? And, you know, how was this sort of a communications tool, or even the concept of it a communications tool for your consumer members?
So as a cooperative, we are really tuned into our members' wishes, wants, dissatisfaction. So there's several things that we do throughout the course of time to get feedback from members, from our membership. Every year we host what's called an annual meeting, and we get roughly, you know, it's not a tremendous turnout, but 200 to 300 people come. And it's, we do a business meeting, we hold elections of our board of directors, and we take questions from the audience. And we get a lot of feedback at that meeting. If people have concerns or issues on their mind and they come out to the meeting, they'll definitely tell us there. So we have the annual meeting and people have an opportunity to talk then. We also have smaller community meetings. We do one in October. That's a smaller gathering. We might get 30 people to come. But again, it's an opportunity to express your issues, concerns, come talk to the board of directors, come talk to the general manager, and raise anything that's on your mind. And then we also issue a newsletter 10 times a year, and people will write in relative to the newsletter. They can call in at any time. And the newsletter really stimulates questions and concerns. Like whenever we have a rate increase, we'll let people know in advance through the newsletter, and people they'll email us, call us, and engage with us to ask what's going on our system.
Okay, so nobody was shy, in other words.
No, very little shyness going on in this.
Oh, yes, that's part of it. Okay, let's see here. What information sources and methods are you using to forecast load in light of your beneficial electrification efforts?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So I am excited to see increased load because we've had a declining load for the last probably decade. And I'd like to see that trend change and see some increasing load. Right now, what we're doing is we're relying on load research from other entities, because WEC is a really small utility. We're not doing end use load forecasting and getting into the granularity. So what we're doing is borrowing from our state-owned transmission provider. And I mean state-owned in that all the utilities have an ownership stake. So this entity, it's a transmission owner called Velco. Velco does a very detailed and elaborate load forecast for the state. What I'm doing is taking their data and saying, okay, if their load forecast is applied to WEC, how would I see electric vehicle deployment, cold climate heat pump deployment behave in our service territory? And I'm using their rates of growth in forecasting for our load forecast. And then what I'll do is contrast that to other public sources, like the ISO New England does load forecasting on several different types of studies. And I'll compare and contrast their data to what Velco is using, and we're backing into a load forecast using that methodology. So it's basically borrowing from other folks that are able to afford, fancy, detailed, big effort load forecasting, and taking the results of those and applying it to Washington Electric Co-op.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the state regulatory process, you filed the IDP with the state commission. Was it a long, drawn-out process, or was it something that was fairly streamlined, or you got regulators on the phone? You don't need to comment if you don't want to.
Our regulators are great.
Okay.
In Vermont, we've approached it as in a collaborative way with our regulators. And I'm not going to say that it's always been this way in the past. I mean, I've been around the utility space here for 30 years, and my first 10 years at another utility was the combative nature with the regulators was difficult. But I would say in the last 20 years, our regulators have worked with us, not against us. And the way we approach IRP in our planning is we bring them along the way. We kick off, before we even get going in terms of the work, we'll have a meeting with the regulators and say, this is what we're planning to do. These are our thoughts. These are our issues that we want to talk about and explore. And we'll do some back and forth exchanging in the very beginning of the process. And then midway through, as assuming we reach agreement on this is the plan, midway through the IRP effort, I'll share chapters with the regulators in advance to say, here's what we're working on. So they come along through the process rather than being surprised when we file in July. They've seen work along the way, so they're basically on board with what we're doing. So the IRP work I've done in the state of Vermont in the last 15 plus years has been very collaborative. It's been a healthy process. And, utilities spend quite a bit of money on these efforts. And for me, it's important that the regulators get something out of it, and so too does the local utility get something out of it. So our goal is to make something that's informative to us and useful to the regulators as well, but most importantly, informative to the utility to be an effective planning tool, because otherwise it's just something that you spend a bunch of money on, you do a report, you stick it on a shelf, and you never look at it. The WEC IRP, we're frequently looking at it. Our board of directors will ask questions. I can cite to the IRP, bringing charts and data from it. And it's been a very useful educational tool. So I look at it as a very effective way that we can collaborate with our regulators, but also use it as a tool for many other purposes here at WEC, and it's been a very good piece of work. It's important for us.
All right, thank you very much. So that's a very positive note that we can end on, unless anybody else has any further questions. I'm not seeing any more pop up in the questions box. But oh, there we go. We got one. Does WEC have a sense of how many of their net metering customers also have battery storage? And do you anticipate a growth in batteries at the distribution system or at the bulk system?
We do have a head count, and I don't have that number right in front of me right now, but there are a handful of customers that are installing at-home battery systems. It's not a lot because the expense for the project or for the batteries is pretty high right now. There are some utilities in the state of Vermont. Green Mountain Power has a battery storage program where the utility buys the battery and the customer pays like a monthly fee for that. We have not embarked on that because I'm not sure the costs and benefits are there for us yet, and it might be something we look at down the road. But for right now, it's all on the customer side if they want to deploy batteries on their system. We do have a lot of customers that employ fossil fuel generators on our system, and that's just driven purely by the need for reliability. Just given the rural nature of our service territory, you can imagine, dense forest, very wooded areas that we go through in terms of our lines. And when there's a power outage, it's difficult for us to get quickly to all the places where a tree might be on a line and clear that. So we've got a large deployment of at-home generators on our system. And, ideally, we'd be able to improve reliability if people won't need those, but batteries may be something in the future for people to consider if we can get the price tag down.
Okay. I think that the next question had to do with the potential impact of batteries on your retail sales and on your peak shaving, but I think that you pretty much covered that in your response. Yeah. Thank you. So, all right. Any further questions? Well, I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds to see if anybody is furiously typing in. I think so. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm turning it. Thank you very much, Patty, and all the questions that came in. Certainly appreciate it, and this has been very illuminating for me here at NRACA. Kirsten, are you going to take it from here on out?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. I just wanted to thank all of the attendees, as well as the U.S. Department of Energy for the support of the task force in this webinar. And then, of course, I want to thank Marianne for great moderating and Patty for a great presentation, which I think was really interesting and highlighted some of the co-op aspects of distribution and resource planning. So thank you very much. So this concludes the webinar. As I mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the NARUC-NASEO Task Force website to all members, and including the slides. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.